By the end of June 1994, the border between Rwanda and Zaire was marked by widespread disorder. Large numbers of people were crossing in a short period of time, creating one of the most sudden population movements in recent history. Entire communities were displaced as events inside Rwanda reached a breaking point. This movement followed the violence that took place earlier that year. Over approximately 3 months, an estimated 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda. The victims included Tutsis and also Hutus who were not aligned with the violence. The killings affected civilians of all ages, including men, women, and children. Before colonization, Hutu and Tutsi were not races or fixed tribes in the way they later became. They shared language, culture, religion, land. The terms mostly describe social roles. Tutsi cattle-owning elites, Hutu primarily farmers. Movement between groups was possible through marriage, wealth, or status. Conflict existed, yes, but not mass ethnic extermination. The question is, how did we get here? Don't forget to subscribe, share, and like. Not because of the algorithm, but because this right here is only the beginning. What we uncover in this series will challenge what you were taught, what was hidden, and what was deliberately erased. Africa's borders were not drawn to unite people. This decision wasn't a mistake. It was calculated.
Africa is home to over 1.4 billion people, over 3,000 ethnic groups, and more than 2,000 languages. Yet the borders that define this vast continent were drawn by fewer than 50 European men, none of them African.
The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a pivotal event in the history of Africa and European colonialism. At the time, Africa was a continent rich in resources, and the scramble to claim territories and exploit its wealth was intensifying among European powers. The conference, convened by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, aimed to establish ground rules for the division of Africa among these powers to avoid potential conflicts. However, the conference was far from a fair and just negotiation between African nations and European powers. The African leaders were not invited to participate, and decisions about the division of their land and resources were made without their consent.
They drew borders with rulers' signatures, often on maps so inaccurate that entire rivers, mountains, and villages were misrepresented. They combined rival groups into one colony, split cohesive societies across multiple empires, and created administrative zones designed to extract maximum resources at minimum cost. They were drawn to serve imperial profit and control. Most of the continent today exists within lines that make little sense on the ground, cutting through kingdoms, ethnic groups, and natural trade networks. These were not accidental boundaries. They were the result of treaties signed far away, with rulers who had never seen the lands they were dividing, with no regard for the people who would be forced to live within them.
This blatant disregard for African sovereignty and self-determination had far-reaching consequences that still resonate today. The arbitrary borders drawn during the conference fragmented African societies, leading to the eventual colonization of the entire continent and the exploitation of its people and resources. The Berlin Conference serves as a stark reminder of the dark legacy of European imperialism and the lasting impact it has had on Africa's history and development.
But here's what they didn't expect. People did not disappear or vanish into compliance. Kingdoms with centuries of diplomacy, trade, and culture were suddenly torn apart. Communities that had lived together peacefully were separated, while rivals were forced into uneasy coexistence. Traditional governance structures were undermined, replaced by foreign administrators whose loyalty was to distant capitals rather than the people on the ground. Taxes, labor demands, and laws favored colonial priorities, not local needs. The consequences were immediate and profound. Conflict erupted in places where artificial borders imposed incompatible groups together. Wars that had been historically contained now spilled across colonial lines. Economic systems designed for local stability were disrupted, as ports, trade routes, and resources were claimed by new authorities with no understanding of local networks. Even after independence, these borders remained. But here's what they didn't expect. These borders created long-term vulnerabilities that persist today. Ethnic tensions, regional inequalities, and political instability are often tied directly to the arbitrary lines drawn by colonial powers.
Berlin Conference gave us countries like Gambia, Djibouti, Burundi, Central African Republic, Togo, Lesotho, Eswatini. The list goes on. As a matter of fact, all African countries. And they did one more thing. They took all these little bitty countries. They had this great big old map of Africa across from them, strategizing. The more powerful the kingdoms were, the more they got along together, the more countries that came out of there, and the more languages that came out of there. Picture yourself driving from Zambia. You're speaking English. And pretty soon you are in Angola. You're speaking Portuguese. And pretty soon you are in DRC. You're speaking French. Pretty soon you are in Equatorial Guinea. You're speaking Spanish. Pretty soon you are in Cameroon. You're back. English. Northern Cameroon. French. Pretty soon you are in Nigeria. English. Who does that? This was all by design to cause maximum destruction of a people. Give it a generation, the people who used to be one will not even know that they were related. History tells us that the husband and wife went to bed in Zambia. When they woke up, the wife was in Zambia, then the husband was in Malawi.
Many of today's disputes over land, resources, and identity can be traced back to colonial decisions made with a ruler's signature in Europe. When a modern African leader tries to govern, they do so within borders that were designed for extraction, not for the well-being of the population. Conflicts over land, resources, and representation are echoes of decisions made in distant offices over a century ago. Across the continent, countries face challenges that can be traced back to colonial calculation. Civil wars, insurgencies, and separatist movements often follow the artificial lines imposed by Europe. Economic disparities between regions are frequently tied to historical decisions about resource allocation. Social tensions, political disputes, and even migration patterns bear the imprint of these borders. Yet, Africa's story is also one of resistance and adaptation. Despite borders drawn for profit, societies have found ways to survive, trade, and govern themselves. Cultural and economic networks persist, and people have carved out identities that transcend arbitrary lines on a map. Borders could divide land, but they could not divide spirit. The lesson is clear. Borders drawn for convenience and exploitation have consequences that last centuries. They shape societies, politics, and economies in ways that are often invisible until crises emerge. Every conflict, every political tension, every regional inequality is connected to decisions made by imperial powers that viewed Africa as a ledger, not a living continent. This is the story of Africa's most expensive lie. Borders that promised control but delivered instability. Lines drawn for profit but paid for inhuman lives, social disruption, and political instability.
When the Europeans colonized Africa, they cared about one thing above all else: profit. Whether it was gold from Guinea, rubber from the Congo, or diamonds from South Africa, the goal was to extract resources and send them back home. What wasn't taken into account were the divisions among the Africans themselves. What this resulted in was cohesive nations like the Maasai being divided between English Kenya and German East Africa, what later became Tanzania. And the bigger the nation was, the more divided it often became. The Yoruba nation, for example, with a population today of 44 million people, were split between English Nigeria, French West Africa, German Togoland, and the English Gold Coast. Directly north, the Hausa nation, with a population of 75 million today, were divided in half by English Nigeria and French West Africa, what eventually became Niger, both of which were partially included within the borders of modern-day Nigeria, alongside the Igbo, another tribe of around 49 million people whose traditional lands lie entirely within the country's borders. And that's not to mention all the smaller tribes crammed in between them, often leading to intense competition over the lands collectively deemed as theirs. For some perspective, Spain today has nearly the same population as the Yoruba. France has slightly fewer people than the Hausa, and the Igbo have a population greater than Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands combined. So imagine someone coming into Europe, drawing a country that included only half of Spain, half of France, and also all those other guys. That is a simplified version of what Nigeria and many other African nations are. In the worst cases, these borders created a mess of civil wars, revolutions, and genocides within and between many African nations as the people tried to better align their countries to their nations. These events serve as reminders of just how impactful lines on a map can be. But the great thing about borders and what this whole disaster proves is that borders are just that, lines on a map that can be changed. So if we know the borders don't work for Africa, we have to ask, can the borders of Africa be fixed?
To understand Africa today, to understand its challenges, successes, and resilience, we must first understand the borders that were forced upon it. They are the invisible architecture of modern conflict and the hidden blueprint behind much of the continent's enduring struggles. Africa's story is bigger than any single country, leader, or generation. It is the story of a continent whose fate was calculated by outsiders, whose people resisted, adapted, and persevered, and whose consequences still echo today. This is not just history. It is a lens to understand the present and a call to examine the forces that continue to shape Africa, often in silence. Africa does not need to be saved. It needs to be rebuilt on its own terms. For over a century, the continent has been reacting to borders it did not choose, economies it did not design, and political systems imposed for control rather than cohesion. The mistake many make is believing Africa's problems are rooted in culture, corruption, or incompetence. The truth is more uncomfortable. Africa is still operating inside systems designed to extract, divide, and weaken it. Until those systems change, progress will always be fragile. The first thing Africa must do today is reclaim narrative power. No society can rebuild itself while accepting stories written by others. Africa is still explained to the world through crisis headlines, aid campaigns, and foreign analysis. This affects investment, diplomacy, self-confidence, and even how Africans see themselves. Nations that control their narrative control their future. Africa must invest in its own historians, journalists, filmmakers, researchers, and educators, not as propaganda tools but as truth-tellers. When a people understand their past accurately, they stop inheriting shame that does not belong to them. But narrative alone is not enough. Africa must confront the reality of borders without pretending they will magically disappear. Redrawing borders is dangerous and unrealistic, but pretending they don't cause harm is equally dishonest. African states must move toward practical regional integration, shared infrastructure, open trade corridors, coordinated security, and cultural exchange that weakens artificial divisions. People already live across borders. Trade already ignores borders. Policy must catch up to reality. This means strengthening regional blocs not as talking shops, but as functional economic and political systems. Roads must connect regions, not just capitals. Rail lines must link production zones, not colonial ports. Customs systems must prioritize African trade over foreign imports. When Africans trade with each other more than with former colonial powers, real sovereignty begins. Next, Africa must redesign its economies away from extraction and dependency. For decades, African countries have exported raw materials and imported finished goods, repeating a colonial economic model under new flags. This is not accidental. It is structural. True reform means processing resources locally, supporting manufacturing, and protecting strategic industries until they are strong enough to compete. Every developed nation did this. Africa was told it must not. Economic independence also requires breaking the cycle of debt dependency. Loans that fund consumption instead of production trap nations in permanent repayment. Africa must prioritize long-term investments. Energy, education, technology, agriculture, and health systems that reduce external reliance. Aid and loans should serve strategy, not survival. But here's the uncomfortable truth many avoid. None of this works without leadership reform. Africa does not suffer from a lack of intelligent people or capable administrators. It suffers from political systems that reward loyalty over competence and short-term survival over long-term planning. Leadership must become boring again, focused on systems, institutions, and continuity, not personality and power. This means strengthening institutions so they outlive individuals. Courts must be independent. Electoral systems must be credible. Civil services must be professional. When leadership becomes predictable and accountable, conflict decreases, investment increases, and societies stabilize. No foreign power can build this for Africa. It must be internal and relentless. Africa must also invest aggressively in its youth, not just in slogans but in real opportunity. The continent has the youngest population in the world. This can be a dividend or a disaster. Education systems must shift from rote learning to problem solving, technical skills, and innovation. Young people must see a future at home, not just abroad. When talent leaves permanently, nations bleed slowly.